So we're joined by Dr. Paul Angermeier today, professor of the Department of Fish and Wildlife Conservation at Virginia Tech, to address an extraordinarily challenging and important topic, the effects of climate change on Appalachian rivers and streams. I'm going to introduce our speaker here in a moment, but first, let me briefly set the stage. And the mission of the West Virginia Rivers Coalition is to preserve and restore West Virginia's rivers and streams to provide clean water for all West Virginians. And as you know, West Virginia is a headwaters state. We're blessed with over 40,000 miles of rivers and streams. These are rivers that not only sustain us in the mountain state, but also provide water for millions of people living downstream on the Ohio River and the Potomac River on the east. And it's also, important that our headwater state provides all sorts of habitat for a diversity of aquatic species, some of which are found nowhere else on Earth. And we know that climate change is already impacting us here. The National Climate Assessment shows that air temperatures are increasing and that increasing extreme weather events are on the rise here in West Virginia as well. And we've seen this just over the last couple of years. We've seen both massive droughts and floods just over recent years, during the same year even. And these impacts come on top of the historical challenges we faced for many generations: acid mine drainage, land use, industrial pollution, and all the rest. So it's a compounding challenge, let's be honest about that. And there's no doubt that this challenge is here today. And so we have to do what we can to understand it in order to deal with it. And that brings us to our presenter today. Dr. Paul Angermeier is professor in the Department of Fish and Wildlife Conservation at Virginia Tech, and he's also, congratulations, recently retired assistant unit leader for the Virginia Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit with the U.S. Geological Survey. He's a leading expert in fish ecology in the Appalachian Mountains, and he's led pioneering work on many imperiled species such as American eel, candy darter, roanoke, log perch, and many other Appalachian fishes. I think you'll find that a hallmark of his research program is a focus on ecological applications of theory for conservation. For example, his original work established much of the foundation for how the Clean Water Act is implemented to conserve aquatic life. He's also investigated the socioeconomic and cultural aspects of conservation as well. And so that's an important diversity of a research portfolio. And along the way, he's mentored many graduate students and supported many, many colleagues. The only dubious thing I can say about him is his choice of graduate students, because he accepted me into his research team when I was working on my PhD from 2004 to 2007 at Virginia Tech. Hey, Paul, everyone makes mistakes, okay? No, but for real, for
That
real.
wasn't one of them.
Yeah. But it truly is my privilege to host my mentor and my friend in this seminar today. So with that, Paul, take it away. I understand you have some slides to share, and then we'll try to reserve some time for Q&A at the end.
Great. Thank you, Than, for the very kind introduction.
That looks good.
All right, great. Well, thank you for inviting me, Than. I'm really looking forward to interacting with your West Virginia River Coalition folks and whoever else is online. Let me just go ahead and start. Before I get started with my own presentation, I want to acknowledge that the lands and waters where I work and live and have built my career on really were stolen from Native nations across Virginia and across the Appalachian region in general. And Virginia has a rich history of Native Americans all the way from the East Coast. You've got the Powhatans in the Piedmont. You've got the Monacans, and around Blacksburg, the Tutelos, and then to the west, the Cherokee. And many of these groups are still active and thriving. So the day I want to cover, as Than implied, a very complex and broad question of a problem, and that is climate change, and particularly its influence on stream fishes, which is my expertise. And I'm in very broad strokes, I'm going to try to cover these two questions. How does climate change influence stream fish assemblages? And I'll give you examples from local and regional contexts. And then the second question is, which fish species are particularly vulnerable? And I'll give you some examples of those. And so in terms of my outline for today, a very course outline is I'll very briefly give you sort of ecological primer of Virginia fishes. And those fishes provide the lens through which I will talk about climate change and try to understand its consequences. Then I'll switch gears and talk about some of the main physical dimensions of climate change, in particular changes in water temperature, stream flow, and fine sediment loading to streams. And then ultimately I'll get to the main question, that is, what are the consequences for freshwater fish assemblies? Again, all in broad strokes. But first, a caveat or two. I am a lowly fish ecologist. I'm not a climate scientist, so my understanding of this tremendously complex and broad problem of climate change is limited. And so I will cover only a small sliver of what's known about climate change effects, and that sliver is going to be biased heavily by my own familiarity with the scientific literature. The peer-reviewed literature remains the gold standard for what counts as for scientific knowledge, as well as Than sort of alluded to, I've been blessed over the years of my career to have many excellent graduate students and colleagues that I work with, and so I'll share some of the research that I've been involved in that is germane to climate change. This is a pie chart showing the primary groups of freshwater fishes in Virginia. And what you need to remember here is that there are many families, probably 20 or so, but the bulk of the species are dominated by minnows and perches. And so the cyprinids are another fancy name for minnows. Over half of the species in Virginia are either minnows or darters. Percids, or the group perch family, includes things that some people are familiar with, like yellow perch and walleye, but also dozens of small fishes that are also perch species, and those are called darters, and I'll give you some more examples of those later. But then there's some other, two or three other families that are quite diverse, including the sunfishes, which include things like largemouth bass, bluegill, and some of the panfishes that are very popular, and suckers, as well as a number of catfishes. And there's a whole slew of other families that have fewer numbers of species, but are equally interesting to people who study fishes. Than was gracious enough to put together an analogous pie chart for West Virginia fishes, and this kind of shows the same picture in that most of the species in West Virginia are also minnows and darters, and most of the same families are represented. You've got the most numerous, the families with the most numerous species are things like sunfishes, the Centrarchidae, suckers, Catastomidae, and catfishes, Ictaluridae. So very similar in terms of the general composition, although both of these states have large numbers of species that are not common to both. So the species tend to be restricted to one state or another oftentimes. So let me then introduce this notion of ecological guild. And we've got these hundreds of species, and so we don't want to talk about necessarily each one individually. And so ecologists like to group things into bins of sorts. And one way, and we call those bins guilds oftentimes to reflect the way fish operate. And so there are several different dimensions which we can use to divide fish into groups. The way they use habitat, the kinds of things they eat, how they reproduce, and of course temperature tolerance is certainly germane to climate change. So let me just quickly talk a little bit about some of those aspects of freshwater fishes. So fish feed anywhere they can find food, basically, and some species they tend to narrowly focus on one part or another of the stream. And so some fish will feed at the surface primarily, others will feed primarily in the water column, and many others feed primarily on the bottom. And those are called benthic fishes. And I highlighted benthic fishes in this case because those are the species that are probably most sensitive to climate change. And fish eat about anything that has energy that they can digest. So certain species will focus on one thing or another, but the kinds of things that are eaten by freshwater fishes include anything from mud to algae to macrophytes, that is, rooted plants, invertebrates, vertebrates, and in a few species like lamprey even eat blood. So they're very diverse in terms of the kind of dietary habits they have. Now I highlighted invertebrates here because that's the group. Most fishes in streams eat invertebrates at one point in their life, and that's the group that are most sensitive probably to changes in climate change or changes in climate. All right, so here's just some pretty pictures to illustrate some of these benthic fishes that are kind of my favorites to work on. And you start at the upper left, you have a small, one of the small catfishes called mad toms. In the middle there, you have a sculpin, just to give you a sense for their sort of shape and coloration and so forth. On the lower left, we have two species of sucker. The lower right, there's two species of minnows. And the upper right, we have two species of darters. So all those species, as well as a whole slew of others, spend the great majority of their time on or very near the bottom. They have mouths that are often oriented toward the bottom. They tend to eat things right off of gravel particles or whatever's down there. All right, so fish spawning, again, is another sort of bin we use to group fishes. And fishes vary tremendously in terms of where they spawn and what they spawn on and what kind of care they deliver to their eggs or their babies. So most of the species that are in our streams lay their eggs on the bottom, so they're benthic spawners. But some species also lay their eggs in the water column. And they tend to attach their eggs to almost anything that's stable. So that might be detritus, like chunks of wood or leaves. It could be macrophytes. It could be gravels and cobbles. It could even some species use cavities, which might mean that they excavate a cavity underneath a rock, or they may use an old beer can. So there's all sorts of tactics that fish use to put their eggs and young in. And some of them spend a good deal of effort after the eggs are hatched or before the eggs are hatched to take care of them. So they either clean or aerate the eggs, and some do not. Some basically lay the eggs and then they go off and do other things. But what I've highlighted here in terms of the bottom spawning fishes, the gravel and cobble spawning fishes, and the fishes that have some parental care, those are the ones that tend to be the most sensitive to climate change. And of course, temperature guilds, this is intuitive. I think we can divide all these groups of species. Here I've done simplistically put them into basically four groups. You got the cold water species, which include things like brook trout. Many are familiar with those brook trout. They occur in only the coldest waters in Virginia, West Virginia. You've got other species that are called cool water, and they are a little more tolerant of some warm water. They often overlap with trout. Candy darter is a good example of that, and I'll show you some more studies on candy darter. Warm water species are probably the biggest group in Virginia, West Virginia, and that includes things like largemouth bass. And then you've got some other species that really don't care what temperature it is. They can adapt to almost anything, and American eels are a good example of that. So you see them in all kinds of waters, cold to warm. And again, the cold water and cool water species are the ones that are going to be particularly sensitive to climate change. So now let me transition and talk to you just to put a finer point on some of the changes we're seeing in climate, just to make the point that the earth and waters are warming, and it seems to be that the rates of warming are accelerating. And just to pull out a couple sound bites, basically, back in June of 2021, the little town of Lytton, British Columbia, set the Canadian all-time heat record, on 3 consecutive days. So one day it was 116, one day it was 118, the next day it was 121. So really hot for Canada especially. And just to put that in context, those temperatures are hotter than any day that's ever been recorded in Florida or South America. So extremely hot temperatures just in that 3-day period. Now, spring of 2023, just 3 years ago, Florida Keys had the highest recorded sea surface temperature ever, 101 Fahrenheit. So that's basically hot tub temperature. Ultimately, 2023 became the hottest year ever recorded globally, until it was upset by the following year, 2024, which became the hottest year. So this is definitely a warming trend. Just last month was the hottest March on record across the conterminous U.S., an average of almost 51 degrees Fahrenheit. Just to put that in context, that's 9 1/3 degrees warmer than what we would have thought last century was normal. So very hot periods coming on. And just to put that in a larger context, the period from a year ago till last month was the hottest 12-month period ever recorded across the coterminous U.S. So we're definitely on a heating spree. All right, now before I get into some of the physical and aspects of climate change, I just wanted to make this explicit contrast in between the notions of instantaneous conditions versus the regime of conditions. And a good way to think of this is we often hear people talk about weather versus climate. So you can go out and experience weather right now, but you couldn't necessarily go out and experience climate. And so in this case, I'm going to use the term regime to reflect this sort of integration of conditions over time, and usually that time refers to some sort of annual cycle. And so that's important because many of the features that are in streams that limit or support fishes tend to have these important temporal variation. And that includes things like discharge, which is another word for stream flow, the temperature, of course, and the extent to which sediment is loaded and transported through streams. All those have these important temporal dynamics. And I wouldn't just, at the end of this, I want to convey the point that this temporal variation in any condition is probably as ecologically important as the average condition. Just to illustrate this with an example from Virginia, a former PhD student, Josh Mouser, put this together for some work he was doing in the Upper Tennessee system. But this shows a graph of the observed and simulated stream flow in Powell River, which is headwaters of the Upper Tennessee, from January 2010 through October of 2021. And the blue is the observed. There are gauges out there that actually record how much water is flowing through the river channel. And then Josh put those data into a simulation model to try to replicate that pattern. And you see that the orange line is his simulation. And the main point I want to make here is that you see that the discharge or the stream flow is highly variable. And there are some sort of seasonal peaks and valleys, but some peaks are really high, some peaks are really low. And so there's a tremendous variation that's important to the fishes and everything else that lives there. And so what we tend to do with these kinds of patterns that are highly variable through time is not just talk about the current or instantaneous magnitude, but also talk about the frequency of those magnitudes, or the duration of those magnitudes, or the timing of those magnitudes, or the rate of change. How quickly does it go from low flow to high flow? So all of those temporal components are really wrapped into this notion of flow regime, which has important implications for how fishes and other critters can survive and thrive. All right, now I'm going to shift gears and talk a little bit about what are we thinking is going to happen in the future in terms of changes in precipitation. And I mention this because, of course, precipitation is one of the key drivers of how much water is flowing through the streams. All right, this is a complicated graph, so I want to spend a minute or two walking you through this because it's very important. First, this comes from NOAA. NOAA is a tremendous source of climate data, and you see the website up there where this came from. But I was just on there yesterday, and I had this sort of sunken heart message that as of June of last year, the website's not being updated or maintained. And so all these data that were put into this NOAA site have been archived. That's not to mean that doesn't mean they're not useful, but it's disappointing that the current administration has decided that these kinds of things are not important, and so that it sort of reflects their interest in censoring or even obscuring climate data for those who want to know more about this. So let me go through the graph itself, and I'll try to use my cursor. So first thing to notice is, and try to avoid looking at everything at one time, but notice these gray bars. The gray bars are observed measures of precipitation. I chose Richmond, Virginia. You could choose almost any locality and get the same sort of pattern. So the bars that go up are above the average, and the bars that go down are below the average. And you see these periodic, each of these bars is 1 year basically across this time frame. Now, this gray spread outside the bars is an attempt to take those observed data and put them into a model to predict or to sort of smooth out what is the expected uh, rainfall pattern for that year. If you had all those data to look at, you could put with some sort of confidence intervals around any predicted value, and that's what you would see is this spread of gray peaks. And what again you see is that some years are dry, some years are wet, some years are right on the average, and so that's a typical pattern what we've seen for the last in my lifetime basically. Now, starting in early 2000s, then of course we ran out of observed data, but they can take these kinds of existing data and project in the future what's going to happen, particularly given that we know things in terms of emissions are going to affect the climate, and you can have different scenarios, high emissions versus low emissions, and I don't want to get into the weeds with that. But the point here is that if you project out what's happened over the past 50 years and project into the future, the next 50 to 60 or 70 years, what you see is that there's two patterns I want to point out. First is that these blue and red trend lines, that's the sort of average, is slightly trending up. So over the course of the next century, we're going to see a slight increase in the average rainfall. What's more striking to me is that what you see is the broadening of this peak and valley spread. And so you see these tremendous high peaks and these tremendous low lows. And what that tells you is that from year to year, and even within years, you're going to see this tremendous variation in how much rainfall occurs. So we're going to see wet years that we've never seen before in history. We're going to see dry years that we've never seen before in history. And so that kind of variation across seasons and across years is what the new normal is going to be. And that's an important message to take home. All right. So again, the main shifts of course, the changes in rainfall are going to translate into changes in stream flow. And what we're going to see is greater stream flows on average. And you might say, well, if you're living in a stream, more water is good, right? Well, yes and no, but I think the increased flow sort of belies the ecological risk that's associated with that because it comes in big flashes, in big floods necessarily, and not steadily. And so what you're seeing is this greater flashiness, what we call flashiness in hydrologic terms, ups and downs of stream flow. And these ups and downs over seasons and years are especially exacerbated when you have urbanized watersheds, and it's also going to be more pronounced in headwaters than in say, mainstream rivers. So those kinds of variabilities have important implications for fishes. And in particular, you don't think of fishes as being especially vulnerable to high flows. But if you're a tiny fish, like a larval fish, it makes a lot of difference. And so I just want to put this picture in there to illustrate. This is work that Joe Buckwalter, one of my current PhD students, did a few years ago on some larval fishes from the Roanoke River. And what this just shows that these happen to be 6 species of darters, larval darters, but larval fishes don't have a lot of swimming capacity. So any kind of sudden and massive change in flow is likely to blow them out downstream, which means if you have such floods occurring during periods when there are a lot of young have just emerged as larvae, or maybe a little bit bigger than larvae, fry, it's likely that they're going to perish, and so those populations could see a total failure of recruitment for that year, for example. So it has these kinds of floods can have tremendous impact on stream fishes. So let me shift and talk about the same sort of patterns, projections we see for temperature. And I put this in there because temperature is really a key driver of fish growth. And so growth is linked to survival. So any changes in temperature regime are going to have important implications for how a fish can grow and survive and the populations that result from that. The same sort of figure we saw for rainfall, we see here for temperature, again, just for Richmond, Virginia, but it could be anywhere. And again, the same sort of format. The bars are observed data above and below the average, and you can develop this sort of projected pattern based on the observed data, and then projecting into the future what we're going to see in terms of changes in temperature with respect to in response to certain levels of emissions. You see this broadening pattern. So the same sort of thing, you see an upward trend, more striking for temperature than for rainfall, but an upward trend over the next 50 to 60 years. But again, you see this, what's really striking is not just the trend, but the variation across seasons and years. So that by the time we get out to, say, 2050, we're going to see probably a doubling of the expected variability from year to year that we've been accustomed to in the previous century. So we don't really know how this is going to play out in terms of effects on critters, but it's got to be significant. All right, so again, just to remind you, the temperature gills then that are going to be most affected by these changes in temperature are because of the rising temperatures of water, are going to be these cold water and cool water species, things like brook trout and candy darter. And I'll show you some more examples of that in a few minutes. The other effect of climate change that I want to emphasize here, which maybe goes under the radar for a lot of folks, but I think is probably one of the most severe potential impacts for fishes in particular, and for a lot of invertebrates as well, is the changes in the loading and transport of fine sediment. And I say this because fine sediment is a key driver of habitat quality. Many fishes are just not very tolerant of a lot more mud. And so as we see more and more rainfall, you're going to see more and more fine sediment being loaded into the streams. And that sediment is also bringing in all kinds of pollutants, in particular nutrients, because phosphorus adheres to sediment particles, and then the nitrogen that's eventually deposited by wind on land that also gets washed into streams. So we can see not just this overloading of mud, but also of nutrients, which leads to other kinds of problems with productivity and so forth, the eutrophication. All right, so now let me finally get to where we wanted to get to from the beginning, and that is, well, how is all these changes in water, precipitation, flow, and sediment, how's that going to affect the fish assemblage composition? So I'll give you a few examples. I wasn't involved in this work, but Pat Fleavy, who was in our department, she's a Forest Service scientist in our department years ago, put this paper together. And this is just 20 years old, so this is not news. And so we've been working on these kinds of problems for a long time. In this particular case, she was working on brook trout, which of course is a hugely popular fish. And what this image shows is a series of projections of habitat suitability and ultimately population distribution if you have different levels of increase in temperature. So in the upper left, we have a 0.5 degree C increase. The lower left, we have 2.5 degrees. Upper right, 3.5, and lower right, 5.5. So what you see is this incremental change in if you look at just basically an image of how much black is on this map, you see that it begins to thin out and shrink, because fewer and fewer of these habitats are suitable in terms of temperature for brook trout. So all you see is because they tend to be on these mountain peaks, they get isolated. So each mountain peak may have a few streams that can support trout, but there's not any way for those trout to communicate with each other. So you have this increasing fragmentation, isolation, and populations, which is a tremendous problem if you're trying to conserve brook trout. All right, let me switch to another species that's one of my favorites, and that's Roanoke logperch. And it's a species that, like many others, is very sensitive to fine sediment. Not so much to temperature, but to fine sediment. And I'm going to draw from work by Mallory Hirschler. She led this particular project. She was a master's student up at Plymouth State University in New Hampshire. And so we did some work. Again, I'm going to point out Roanoke logperch is a species that only occurs in Virginia, North Carolina. And you can see from this image on the lower left that it it has this peculiar habit of flipping over small stones and grabbing the bugs that live there. So it's very sensitive to fine sediment because if you feel that cover that pebble with mud, it can't flip it over and find any bugs. So it's very tied to clean, silt-free substrates. All right, and just give you a quick overview of some of the impacts of fine sediment in general. By fine sediment, I basically mean silt and sand. And this isn't a problem that's new. It's already a pervasive problem that's and a chronic and strong impact on lots of fishes and other invertebrates in streams. But the problem is going to increase as climate change and storm intensity increases. So too much fine sediment, mud basically, has profound effects on all levels of biological organizations, from individuals to populations to communities, because it basically interferes with everything that a fish does: breathing, eating, reproducing, finding food, being able to having the stream being able to produce the food for the fish to eat. And so these excessive fine sediment has these overarching consequences for streams. It impairs their health in major ways. It contributes to species imperilment. It causes loss of valuable ecosystem services, things like recreational fishing and clean water for drinking. So it's a pervasive problem already, and it's just going to get worse as climate change occurs. And just to give you a sense for how we go out and measure this, this is a cartoon figure just basically showing a number of pebbles or cobbles, and to the extent to which the spaces between those get filled with fine sediment, that's a term we call embeddedness. And so the embeddedness is sort of from the bottom up of the stream bottom, but the silt cover is the degree to which the silt covers the top of the stones and surfaces in the stream. And so we go out and measure both of those things, get a sense for how much deposited sediment is there. And then we can make some predictions about which species are going to be more or less affected by increasing amounts of deposited sediment. And I talked about the different guilds of feeding and spawning and so forth. So here's a way to sort of apply that to a study where we choose things like feeding location, attributes like a fish, like feeding locations, food preference, how much parental care they provide, what spawning substrate they use. And we can sort of arrange species along some gradient from less sensitive to more sensitive. So again, more benthic species are going to be more sensitive to more sediment. Specialized feeders are going to be more sensitive. Species that provide some parental care are going to be more sensitive. And lithophil is a fancy term for species that need clean gravels. So species that need clean gravels are also going to be more sensitive to adding mud to streams. So we set up a study in the Roanoke River Basin on the Piedmont a few years ago, and this particular system has over 80 species that were in there. And at the sites where we sampled, we caught over half of them. So we caught a lot of species of fish, and so this provides a nice background on which to assess the effects of sediment. And we chose these sites we tried to set up a gradient of sediment loading, and we used known measures of things like soil particle, soil types, slopes of streams and watersheds and that sort of thing to estimate how much sediment is going to be loaded in those streams using this very standard model called the revised universal soil loss equation model. And so we set up these sites to basically represent a gradient from low to high sediment loading. And we went out and sampled fish and measured transects of habitat where those fish were caught, and did a very detailed assessment of how much deposited sediment was there, and put those into some regression models. And I don't want to get in the weeds with how that was done, but the take-home upshot was that abundances of all those traits that we measured for the fishes responded negatively to embeddedness and to silt cover. And embeddedness were particularly are feeding traits were especially sensitive to embeddedness. Spawning traits are especially sensitive to silt cover. The largest effect, that is the steepest slope in a regression line, was embeddedness effect on specialist feeders, those fish that eat only insects, for example. And Roanoke logperch is an example of that. One interesting thing was that we didn't see anything like a threshold response. That is, any change in deposited sediment, whether it's on the low end or the high end, still showed an effect on the proportional abundance of these different groups of fishes. And the population responses were consistent with these sort of trait-specific responses. So this was one of the first successful projects to show empirically that the more mud you have in a stream and in fairly small habitat configurations, the fewer fish you're going to see that are sensitive to that mud. All right, so there are also species that are sensitive to temperature and sediment. So logperch are not so much sensitive to temperature, but candy darter are. So candy darters are a good example of a species that's sensitive to both temperature and sediment. They're endemic to the New River Basin. That's the only place in the world they occur, Virginia and West Virginia. They're very attractive fish. And this is just to illustrate their story, which is not so attractive. This is a map that another of my PhD students pulled together a few years ago, Mariana Castaneda Guzma. And this shows the sort of current status of candy darter. And I'll point out first, the green etches are streams where candy darter still occur. And you see most of those are in Upper Gauley and Greenbrier. And there's a few scattered ones down here in Virginia. We've got 4 populations remaining in Virginia, but the big story is that all the red is where they've been extirpated. So there's historical records of those from 100 years ago or less, and they are no longer there. So tremendous decimation of candy darter distribution. That has been let me just go back. So much of that happened over the course of the last 100 years or so, and basically in response to changes in sediment and temperature. But it's been exacerbated lately by this handsome bugger, variegated darter, which is a very closely related species that interbreeds with candy darters and basically hybridizes them out of existence. It's not native to the New River Basin, but is native to the Ohio Basin. So this is just an image that I pulled from my former master's student, Corey Dunn, who worked on candy darters. And I just want to point out, to focus on these upper 2 plots. And what Corey did was to go out and find the records where candy darter had been historically detected and where they hadn't been historically detected. And then he basically went out and measured things like temperature and sediment, deposited sediment at those places, and he put those into models. And it basically showed that on the right, on the left side here, we've got the spring mean daily temperature. On the right side we have embeddedness, and what you see is there's this along this gradient of temperature, there's a pretty sharp decline. And once temperature gets above, say, 13 degrees, the probability of finding a candy darter there is very low. And this is based on these historical data. And the same thing goes with embeddedness. If you go back and measure, you go back to those places where candy darter were, where they occurred or didn't occur, and you measure embeddedness, you see that there's this sharp decline. Once you get this embeddedness percentage goes below, say, 20, or goes above, say, 25%, the chances of finding a candy darter there are very reduced. So Corey followed up this work on the historical data with his own observations. He went out to all streams where candy darter had been known to occur, and a few others where they hadn't, and looked at where do all the different age groups. So he looked at young of year, juveniles, and adults, and basically marked where he saw them in the stream and made precise measurements around those particular microhabitats and related that to the amount of deposited sediment. And what you see in these these images is that in each case, all three age groups basically decline as you get more and more deposited sediment. The probability of finding an animal in that particular place declines. So very sensitive to deposited sediment. Well, what do we do with this in terms of conservation strategies? I want to go on a little tangent here because climate change is a big elephant in the room. We can't really expect to fix that in the next, certainly not in my lifetime, but we can do some things, and we can manage those watersheds and those streams a little bit more effectively. We can try to protect them and prevent further impairment. We can try to restore healthy conditions by replanting riparian zones, for example. So there's some things we can do management-wise to improve the chances to mitigate the impacts of climate change. We can also introduce fish populations to places where they've been extirpated. There's ample technology. A lot of species can be propagated and then reintroduced. But one tactic that we use that's often maybe not obvious is we can discover new populations. And I say new because many of the species that are imperiled in particular, we don't know exactly where they occur very well. There's not been a tremendous amount of field work to document their occurrence. And so if you go out, the more you look, the more you may find them. And this is illustrated by Roanoke logperch, which was delisted from the Endangered Species Act as endangered a couple years ago. And the main reason it was delisted is because there were additional populations found in North Carolina. Not so much that we really fixed all the streams where it occurred, but we found these new ones, and they turned out to be more abundant and thriving than we thought. Another example of that is brook trout, and I'll show you a map in just a second that Than provided. So candy darter do overlap with brook trout, and so one of the ways we might look for more candy darter is go out and see where had the brook trout, where do they occur, and maybe they're just downstream of where the brook trout are, and just sort of focus the surveys on those kinds of areas. And this kind of approach actually has an important role for citizen science in that many folks can identify brook trout, and they might point out that it occurs here, but we didn't know. Maybe the state or federal folks didn't know it occurred there. So to the extent that that kind of information can be incorporated into management plans is often very valuable. Let me just go back to this map I showed you earlier of candy darter distribution. Now here again we've got all these red areas where the candy darter has been extirpated, and look particularly in the lower new and this lower part of the greenbrier. Well, it turns out that Than shared this map with me the other day. There have been some newly discovered brook trout sites, and they occur in the lower new and in the lower greenbrier. And so maybe that's a good place we can piggyback on that new knowledge to go out and see if maybe there's some candy darters in some of those watersheds in that vicinity. So anyway, that's just a place where the work on one species can contribute to work on another species that needs some kind of conservation effort. And again, a role for folks who aren't necessarily scientists or managers can still contribute to those conservation efforts. All right, let me then switch a little bit here and talk about land use change. And this is perhaps something that often isn't considered when you think about climate change, but it's really an important partner in climate change, because as human population grows, we increasingly intensify our use of lands and waters as well. And one of the patterns that we see is that the more intensively we use land, that tends to make those habitats drier and warmer. So it's sort of mimics climate change. And then the other thing that happens when you have both climate change and land use change occurring simultaneously, you get these synergistic or additive effects. So let me just talk a little bit about that. And this again is not a new idea. This is some work that Karen Nelson led back in 17 years ago. It's hard to believe that long ago. She's at the University of Maryland, and she led this team of modelers that looked at Maryland Piedmont and was interested in basically examining 39 fish species and trying to assess what are the combined effects of urbanization and climate change on these fishes? And so the goal of this work was fairly broad and trying to predict the combined and separate effects of climate change and urbanization in these Piedmont streams. And in particular, she and her group built these indices, these forecast indices for fish. And this was made up of a very complex model with several submodels, and I'll give you just an inkling of that in a minute, based on species traits that were related to fish growth and reproduction, things I've talked about before. And the idea was to integrate the output from these models into some sort of, and couple that with climate change projections of those days, which were still pretty good, and also have models of hydrology and geomorphology and water temperature and fish growth and reproduction, and put all those together to see what is the outcome for these fish populations. And ultimately then to assess how climate and urbanization induced effects are going to end up changing assemblages of fishes under these different scenarios of urbanization and climate change. So this is a very quick and dirty look at the different models or those fish fitness measures that Karen and her group invented. One was looking at the spawning day availability based on temperature and photo period. The other was looking at spawning substrate suitability, again, related to how much deposited sediment was there, especially during the spawning season. Juvenile growth index, based largely on as a response to water temperature, and then adult growth index, which is a combination of effects of temperature and availability of suitable foods. So all these aspects were modeled, and here's a very complicated cartoon of how that will work. And so not to get too down the weeds with this, but basically we got these two kinds of effects, drivers. You got urbanization, you got climate change, and each of them has their own suite of impacts on these stressors we're calling sediment, flow, temperature, and food production. And these can be evaluated in these daily time steps. And then ultimately, those effects translate into impacts on fishes, both in terms of the spawning. You got these 4 different indices of related to fish. So you got spawning substrate, adult growth, juvenile growth, and spawning days. And so by combining all those model outputs, and I won't show you how that works, the team was able to put together a projection of what happens to the fish populations. The other thing they did was develop, or they had to pull from the model, the climate model, certain scenarios. So there were 4 different scenarios. We had baseline, that is, what were the streams experiencing up to that point? What would you expect to happen if urbanization alone went forward? And then there's a whole bunch of climate change alone scenarios, depending on how much emissions was expected to materialize over the next 100 years, say. So that we chose these 4 different climate change scenarios, and then you can combine the climate change with the urbanization. So we had outputs that reflected each of these combinations, which is way more complicated than I want to present here. But just to give you a sense for the overall patterns, these climate change models that were used are widely accepted, so they weren't very extreme, but they predicted pretty severe and extensive ecological impacts across these streams. And in particular, the effects of urbanization and climate change are additive. So they don't multiply each other, they add to each other. Most of the stream fishes will be stressed by some combination of urbanization and climate change, or 50 to 75% of the fishes. Most game fishes are probably going to decline in abundance because of those changes. And the other important thing to remember here is that the lethal temperature thresholds weren't necessarily reached or exceeded very often. So the impacts that we're seeing on the fishes are not lethal effects of temperature change, but these sublethal effects on things like growth, survival, and that sort of thing. All right, the final topic I want to try to touch on here is and maybe one that's not typically thought of in the context of climate change is fish invasions. by new species. And most native fish assemblages are threatened in one way or another by a suite of potentially invading or currently invading species. And these invaders tend to compromise uh, typical ecosystem functions as well as human economies. The rates and degree to which introduced species are being introduced and invading is increasing rapidly. Some of these are accidental invasions. Some of them are intentional. And a key driver of these is international trade, particularly for aquarium fishes. So as more and more people get involved in trading fish, the more and more we can expect some of those fish to show up in our wild waters. And in particular, um, demand for fish in aquarium, for live food, and these water garden fish. What I show down here at the bottom are two examples of fishes that have invaded and caused more or less significant impacts. On the left is northern snakehead, which is very widespread across much of the Atlantic seaboard now, particularly in Virginia. And then this other species is a blue catfish, which is intentionally introduced in the Chesapeake Bay and is wreaking havoc on a lot of the things like blue crabs and mussels and oysters and things like that, which these are big fish that eat a lot of biomass. This is a project that I was involved in led by Jennifer Howarth a couple years ago. And she and our team put together these predictions of where freshwater fishes were going to be invading across the U.S. And we chose these four main regions: the Sacramento Joaquin in California, the Lower Colorado, the Great Lakes, and the Mid-Atlantic. And the gist of it here is that the different regions are more or less vulnerable to these invasions than others. So a common predictor of how likely an invader is to establish is the climate match between where that species came from and where it's being introduced. So as climates become more and more homogenized, and especially more and more warm, then more and more of these areas match up well enough to support establishment of these invaders. And that's largely driven by temperature tolerances of the species of concern. And so what you see here then in the middle is this very stark expectation for the number of traded species that might be, these are not established yet, but are predicted to be established in the Sacramento San Joaquin. Hundreds of species are going to be available because of changes in flow and temperature to invade that system. Lower Colorado, only 73. Great Lakes, fewer. In the Mid-Atlantic, not so many. So the potential for dramatically changing the fish assemblages varies from region to region. And what's commonplace where those species are coming from is Asia, because that's if you think of the climate match, that's where the climate matches are most substantial. All right, let me wrap this up. Overall conclusions across my whole presentation here are summarized in these few bullets. Here's what I'm thinking the data show for our future for stream ecosystems: higher temperatures, higher stream flows, higher sediment loads, more and more seasonal and annual variation, more and more imperiled species, and more non-native species. With that, I will open it up to questions.
Thank you, Paul. That's fantastic. And that's quite a broad survey of many topics. We just have a few minutes left, so perhaps there's some Q&A in the chat that Autumn could serve up for us. But I appreciate you mentioning the trout water work in West Virginia. That's an important step because it involves citizen scientists and anglers and community groups, watershed organizations. I'll let folks know that there is an update to that information you can find on our website, wvrivers.org. So I'll encourage folks to check that out. But I think what's so important about that story for me is that it started with community groups, citizen scientists, community scientists. So in the last minute that we have left, I'm wondering if you can share some thoughts about the value or role or what people can do in that space. Not everyone can, do a advanced graduate degree, but people can do a lot of things. What are the most important things that people can do at this point?
I think the important things are to make it clear to those who do write and dictate policy what's important to them. What is it about the streams and fishes or whatever that or nature in general that's important, and make that up front and center. And so, to the extent that you can, as a citizen scientist, go out and report on conditions or make observations and enter those into some. Sometimes there are lots of sort of formal places to put that new information. More eyes on the ground means more information, right? And so agencies that are charged with managing resources and certainly scientists too are spread pretty thin. They don't have the capacity to go everywhere and see everything. So the more people can sort of weigh in of here's where I saw this and here's where I saw that and when and why is that important? I think it not only builds data, but it also creates a community of folks who care. And I think that's what policymakers and managers need to know. Who is that community, and why are things important to them?
Right. I should also plug the West Virginia Stream Watch app. We have that link on our website. That's a tool that anyone can use, a free app for your phone to document conditions with images. Also, we have a platform on citizenscience.org, citsci.org, that folks can engage in water monitoring, and that's been successful for a number of projects. So I also want to plug that. Autumn, are there any burning topics that we can touch on in
Yeah,
our last moment here?
we have a few problem solvers that are ready with solutions. So one question, and these are two related questions, so I'll just throw them out there. One question was asking if more frequent major flooding events could theoretically improve embeddedness. And then another commenter asked if adding cobbles and small stones could be added into the streams on top of that accumulated sediment.
Okay, let me address the first. So, do more storms or increased flows reduce embeddedness? Wasn't that the gist of it? I think the short answer is no, because if if the if the flood or the storm was confined to the streams channel, then yes, you expect to see this sort of flushing effect, and that would move that fine sediment downstream. But the problem is, it occurs over the whole catchment. So the more storm you have, the more mud you have entering. So it's probably not going to be a benefit in that sense. And in fact, we see this in Chesapeake Bay. Wet years is what drives the pollution in Chesapeake Bay down. So it's uh, less water is the stream can sort of cleanse itself if it's not given these floods. But the more floods you have, the more problem it has to deal with. Anyway, what was the second one was can you add gravel? Is that something like that?
Yeah, could you add, like as a type of restoration technique, could you add some cobbles and stone on top of the sediment?
That's not a bad idea, and I suspect it's been done. And it could be as a tactic that's complementing other things. But if you can't constrain the mud coming in from the watershed, you're not going to be able to do it, add enough gravel to help. So really, that could be something to sort of jumpstart the habitat quality, I think. If you already had fixed the incoming problem with better watershed management and better riparian and that kind of thing, maybe you need more gravel, and so that could be a short-term tangible fix for that, something like that.
Great. And then the final question we have in the chat is, do you think proposed data centers will affect water temperatures and sediments?
Yeah. Um, there's a lot of hand wringing going on in Virginia. I'm sure West Virginia too about what to do with these centers. And I don't think people really have a sense for what the new ones are going to be bigger and bigger. And I don't think we have a sense for what that's going to be like. But I don't know so much about temperature. The worry that I hear more about is drawing down water tables and stream flows, because they're taking a bunch of water out now. Maybe some of that comes back to the creek. I don't know. But I think the change in hydrology will certainly be remarkable. Uh, the warming, I don't know, because I don't know enough about. I guess if they're returning hot water that doesn't get cooled in some way back to stream beds, then yeah, that's going to be a problem because they use it for cooling as well. But I think the the change in flow regime is probably the biggest concern that I've heard about.
Yeah, that's right. There's been research from ICPRB and others on the Potomac side showing that during drought conditions with forecast development for data centers, that can be the majority of water for the Potomac main stem, which we know is the sole drinking water source for DC and other municipal areas. So extremely important for our downstream partners here in the headwater state of West Virginia. So Paul, thanks for your time. Really do appreciate your willingness and graciousness to show up and share your research here with our community. And I would encourage everyone to check out what we're doing online. The April e-news is out, and other folks can check out what's happening at westvirginiarivers.org. So with that, we'll turn you loose and say thanks for joining us. We'll see you on the next Lunch and Learn.
Oh, great! Thank you very much, and enjoyed it. And certainly here, if you have follow-up questions, I'm happy to try to um, arm wave about those.
Excellent. Okay. Thanks, y'all. Bye.
Bye bye.